Prue agreed that many of my listeners did seem fanatical. He compared them to groupies and the followers of marginal religions. It wasn't the first time someone had pointed out that my audience acted like members of a cult. I nodded, accepting this, then silently waited for his next question. "Can I get back to the original Ghost Radio again? The one you listened to in the hospital?" "Okay." "Did you listen to this show by yourself, or was it popular with the other patients?" "Sometimes I listened alone, sometimes with a friend," I said, trying to sound casual and vague. "Was this friend Gabriel?" I nodded. Shit. I had hoped the interview wouldn't go in this direction, but this guy had clearly done his homework. "And this is the Gabriel who died during some kind of pirate radio broadcast?" I blanched. "Do we really need to talk about this? You host a program about death and ghosts, and you had an experience in your life in which a good friend died during a radio broadcast. It seems related." Prue was right. They were related. I owed almost everything to that catastrophe. I'm still marked by its scars, literally and figuratively. And I lost Gabriel. Gabriel. I still consider him my best friend despite the fact that he's no longer with us. No longer with us. Such an inapt term for Gabriel. No one could be more with us, or with me, at least, than he is. It's been 18 years since his death, and I still feel him around me. That's not meant as a sappy cliché or a bit of tearful, cloying nostalgia. It is a pragmatic affirmation of his inescapable, daily presence. "Don't you think it's important?" Prue asked, breaking my ruminations. "I'd just prefer if it wasn't the focus of the interview." "Well, I don't think it's going to be the focus, but I plan to include some facts about the event, and I'd like them to be as accurate as possible. It's a painful memory for me." Prue wouldn't let it go. "Okay, but remember, if I don't go over this with you, we'll be forced to present the facts based on our research. You'll have no input. Some of the people who told us this story may be biased. I'm giving you the opportunity to ensure that what we print accurately reflects your point of view." I looked out the window. On the street, a homeless man walked by, screaming. I could hear his words through the glass, and I felt like joining him. Instead, I turned back to Prue and fixed him with a forceful stare. "I think we've covered this," I said. After several seconds, Prue nodded, took a breath, looked through his notes, and then, like the good reporter he was, tossed me a softball question. "How do you explain your program's success?" "We talk about stuff that interests a lot of people. I believe that modern society is deeply affected by technological progress. Technology is no longer a tool we use every day. It's inserted itself into the way we perceive reality, the way we see ourselves, the way we relate to our peers and our own memories. Our fears, aspirations, and fantasies are filtered through technology. I see my work as a way for the media to help people reestablish their bond with things that have nothing to do with science, like mythology, the unexplainable." "I didn't realize you were a Luddite." "I'm not, but I think there's more to life than Google, Facebook, and YouTube. There are other forms of communication, deep forms, and people want to share their experiences," I said, knowing my tone had become sharp, but I couldn't shake my anger at Prue for bringing up Gabriel's death. "But it's largely about death, isn't it? Have you listened to my program, Mr. Prue? Your fans have what might almost be termed a necrophilic obsession, an addiction to the macabre. What's your opinion about that? What culture isn't fascinated by everything horrific and terrifying? I'm simply channeling the zeitgeist, giving a form to our subconscious fears. But I also give them hope, the ultimate hope, that death isn't an end, that there's something more. And you don't think that nourishing those fantasies is exploitive, even a form of emotional blackmail? For over 20,000 years, people have been telling ghost stories. We're not trying to blackmail or bribe or extort anyone. We're seeking communion, a way to get a handle on the inexplicable. Hell, I need this program as much as they do. I need these wild conversations. I don't presume to be able to unravel the mysteries of life and death, but I do believe that we can connect more intimately through a feeling as transcendent as terror." Isn't your interest in death just morbid? Plain and simple? Morbid? I stopped myself from replying with an insult. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this accusation, but I never got used to it. It always struck me as arrogant and offensive. What the hell did Prue know about my views on death? As I see it, morbidity is the urgent and uncontrollable need to see that which is forbidden, to peer into the repugnant. What we examine on Ghost Radio is rarely repugnant. It's often quite beautiful. But it's the stuff of horror movies. We don't exploit those emotions in the same way. I'm not out to scare people. The listeners and I frighten each other, and together we work through it. It's new every night. It's not some Hollywood formula that makes Ghost Radio work. It's just human communication, pure and simple. Prue took notes as I continued. I don't like resorting to cliches, but we live in uncertain times. The wars and the catastrophes that have assailed the planet over the past few years threaten to trivialize our mortality, to desensitize us. But in my culture, we maintain a different relationship with death. We play with her. We write to her as if she were an old friend. We invite her in like a drunk who visits unannounced. Prue seemed satisfied with the interview, but as he reached over to turn off the recorder, I stopped him with one final thought. Something as natural as walking consists of repeatedly setting the body momentarily off-kilter. Each time we shift our weight from one foot to the other, we lose our balance for a fraction of a second. We learn to walk by learning to displace ourselves without falling, by losing and recovering our balance almost simultaneously. In the same sense, one might say that we are in a constant balancing act between life and death. What made you tell me that? Joaquin smiled. Because you are about to get up and walk out of this cafe. Prue chuckled. Then, as if possessed by a cybernetic spirit, he reconnected himself to his various communication devices. As he turned on and consulted his technological extensions, recovering the information lost in his time with me, his face lit up. He squinted, and reality seemed to dissolve around him. He gathered up his belongings and walked out of the room, losing and recovering his balance with each step. The instant he left, I returned to one central fact. This interview would tell the story of Gabriel's death, a story I wanted to keep to myself. This was bad. This was very bad. But what could I do? I couldn't stop the magazine from publishing it. It was true. Then the obvious solution revealed itself. I'd steal Newsweek's thunder. I'd beat them to the punch. I'd tell the story myself on the American premiere of Ghost Radio. Chapter 15. The Confession. There were only 10 minutes left in the show. It was now or never. So I took a deep breath and began. Listeners, I know we're new to each other, but I'm going to end this broadcast with a story. A very personal story. I hope it draws us closer together. I hope it makes you understand that you won't be mocked here on Ghost Radio, no matter how wild your tale, because I have wild stories as well. It felt good being in a studio again. Alondra seemed to be enjoying it as well, and Watt, well, he was in his usual loony self. Maybe this would be okay. The show had gone well. Most of the callers wanted to talk about politics, but I still felt good. I knew this final story would change things. It was nice to be calm after the unpredictability of the last few days, when I wasn't fully in control of my emotions or thoughts. Now I was in the place where I always felt in control, and doing what I loved, telling the truth in the dead of night. When I was a kid, My friend Gabriel and I had a group called Los Death Muertos, a Latin rock, punk, experimental progressive band. Maybe some of you still remember us. We had a following back then in the Houston area. Our music was strange, but I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that it was also intoxicating. We used found noises that we had recorded, sampled sounds from the most varied sources. Initially, we only wanted to jam, to explore every possibility offered by our crude instruments and equipment. But beyond these experiments, our musical world was colored by tragedy. That was perfectly understandable. My parents, and Gabriel's as well, died in an automobile accident. The same accident. The car I was in crashed head-on into the car carrying Gabriel's family. Only he and I survived. After the accident and the time we spent in the hospital, our lives became increasingly intertwined. I went to live with my grandmother in Houston, a few blocks away from Gabriel's aunt, who took him in for a while. We shared our time together in a strange limbo, a quasi-absence of authority. We were both pretty wild, but Gabriel was always more daring. Nothing intimidated him. He was always eager to experiment with a new drug, make danger where there was none, get into all kinds of trouble. In short, he was a hellion. Every time we got toasted, he would disappear. Usually he didn't remember where he had been or what he had done, so we started documenting these sprees with Polaroids. The photos we would find in his pockets the following morning were placed in what he called his Diary of Lost Days. I always wanted to keep up with him, but his escapades were so personal, at times I didn't feel welcome. Besides, Gabriel didn't care where he spent the night. In jail, in the bed of an elderly prostitute, in a wealthy person's swimming pool, or in the monkey's cage at the zoo. It was all the same to him. I always went home to sleep. Gabriel's aunt couldn't cope, so he took on a nomadic existence. He slept anywhere. My house, his other friends, a girlfriend's, a stranger's, even the occasional park bench. In time, he became a squatter, living in abandoned buildings. I soon followed him. We shared the most bizarre dwellings. As I spoke, Alondra and Watt grew more disconcerted and irritated. I could tell my decision to confess publicly clearly struck them as idiotic. If I had told them what I was planning to do beforehand, things would have turned out the same. We would have argued, and in the end they would have allowed me to do whatever I wanted. It was not their decision. To spring it on them, though, was insulting. I knew that. It implied that I didn't give a fuck about their opinion. And when it came to this, I didn't. We devoted ourselves to our ambitions. Two musicians on a mission. We thought of ourselves as a kind of fusion of Stravinsky and Dr. Frankenstein, making hybrid creations, combining melodies and organic noise, like the amplified sound of a spider devouring an ant or a praying mantis as it ripped off its mate's head. We recorded everything we could imagine and took it further, mixing those sounds with the static from our homemade radio telescope, an antenna we had built with old circuits that received and distorted radio signals. With a modest sequencer, we mixed these tracks into patterns and added guitars, percussion, synthesizers, and other instruments, not to mention a lot of other noisy junk. It was all part of our experiments. Later, we added computer programs, MIDI samplers, and vocoders to our sound repertoire. Alondra and Watt seemed to drift further away. I knew they wondered why I would unmake the character I had created for Ghost Radio. They liked that creation. It worked. He worked. Explosive at times, composed at others, sometimes sinking into a hermetic reserve. But whatever he wasn't a confessor. He eschewed the maudlin world of the personal. He wasn't the star of the show. The callers were. He was a conduit, a welcoming voice. He lit the campfire and told the world to gather round. I liked him too, but tonight I had to set him aside. This wasn't only about the Newsweek article. I realized that now. This was about the truth. If I launched the American version of Ghost Radio with such a bold declaration of truth, maybe the show would become what I needed it to be. Maybe it would give me the answers I sought. Alondra nervously applied chapstick to her full lips. I know she would have willingly given a liter of blood to escape, but she didn't dare abandon me, especially after her fervent requests to discuss this very subject. We did a lot of crazy things, but we were genuine. At school, when we actually attended, people treated us as freaks. But when we made music, everybody's perception of us changed. It was encouraging to see surprise, fascination, or bewilderment on the faces of those who usually ignored or slighted us. We lost our virginity easily. We had plenty of opportunities with our growing crowd of groupies. Watt, enshrouded in the wires, handles, and buttons of his sound equipment, forced out a smile. Our parents' deaths brought us together. Relationships that develop in situations like ours are so profound that they're difficult to explain. We created our own world and offered the audience visions of it during our performances. They were like a musical Grand Guignol. On stage, we presented our fantasies as well as our nightmares. This was before the concept of flash mobs, those instant crowds that gather using text messages to relay the time and place. But we used low-tech methods like flyers, the loudspeakers of a rundown ice cream truck, or spectacular street signs inviting people to semi-spontaneous concerts and performances held in unique locations. I took a long drink of water. Alondra gazed at me with a mix of hostility and compassion, but Watt looked resigned as he cleaned his nails with a pocket knife. At every concert or performance, we tried to outdo ourselves. We still listened with passion to the great noise groups and bands of the industrial era, but thought, ingenuously, that our music was a step beyond what those legends had accomplished. We compulsively read William Blake, Aleister Crowley, and Eliphas Levi. We were obsessed with all types of death rituals. During one period, we wrote songs in honor of the deceased, chosen randomly from obituaries and foreign newspapers, our lyrics inspired by their stories. We often found profoundly poetic passages in those obituaries. The telephones were ringing. There was no way of knowing whether the callers wanted my head, if they had a generous comment or just a question, if they wanted to share similar experiences, or if they wanted to ridicule me. I ignored them. Once, we connected our guitars and equipment to the school's loudspeaker, sparking a revolt of legendary proportions that ended in a fire and dozens of arrests. We played in public places, abandoned buildings, old churches, pretty much anywhere we could cause chaos and confusion. We were constantly in trouble and spent a lot of time running away, hiding, or under arrest, which only increased the number of our followers. We made CDs that we sold ourselves, and with the money, we bought more equipment and expanded our sound system. It felt like being on a train going at full speed. I guess anybody could have predicted that we were hurtling toward an abyss. A strange expression fell across Alondra's face, like a mother whose child is clumsy at soccer, an expression of humiliation and empathy that you never want to see on a loved one. But I couldn't stop. I was almost at the end. One night, we went to an abandoned radio station at a Mexican university close to the border. We set up an improvised and undoubtedly historically inaccurate altar for Teoyamki, the Aztec god of dead warriors. We connected our equipment to the transmitter and managed to get our music on the air. Afterward, I learned that many, maybe even all, of our fans were listening with euphoria. 11 minutes in, at exactly 2 a.m, there was a sudden power surge. I'm not sure how it happened since there was never an investigation, but it's clear that our equipment caused a short circuit. It was raining that night and water was everywhere. We were more careless than usual, and it appeared to outsiders that we had intentionally caused the disaster. Sometimes I wonder if Gabriel had wanted it to happen, consciously or unconsciously. I am sure of the time, because the digital clock at the studio, perhaps the most modern piece of equipment in the entire station, was blinking, flashing 2 a.m. The last thing I saw before I flew 8 yards in the air was Gabriel. In a deliberately anticlimactic tone of voice, I recounted being saved by the paramedics and how Gabriel was already dead when he arrived at the hospital. I turned off the microphone and took a drink of water, wishing it were tequila. Then I stood up and left the studio. Alondra and Watt didn't follow. A few moments later, I heard Pink Floyd's "Shine on You Crazy Diamond" coming over the monitors. A DJ spouting nonsense on the air is bad, but dead air on a live program is unforgivable. The studio door opened. Watt came out to join me. "What the fuck did you just do? What are you going to do next? Describe your masturbation fantasies? Talk about hemorrhoids? You're going to destroy us." I had to do it. "Why?" I gave him my car keys. "Give these to Alondra. I'm going to walk back to the hotel." And I left. Chapter 16. My Other Girlfriend. The walk left me feeling liberated and elated. There was a spring in my step, and I unlocked the door and entered the hotel room. Alondra was sitting on the edge of the bed. She greeted me with a cold stare, remaining silent for a long time. "I don't understand you," she finally said. "I don't understand you at all." I told her about the Newsweek interview. "That doesn't explain it. Not really. You said we could never refer to that story on the air." "You're not mad at me," I said. "I'm not?" she said, jumping to her feet and shooting me the maddest of mad girl faces. "No, you're not. You're jealous." "Jealous? Jealous?" she screamed, her face reaching a new level of ferocity. "Relax and think about it for a second. You've wanted to talk to me about Gabriel for days. And look what I go and do. I talked to my other girlfriend about him." "The listeners," Alondra said, her anger fading. I nodded. "Pretty crazy, huh? Being jealous of a bunch of anonymous people?" "Oh, I don't know. Some of them sound pretty hot." Alondra laughed. "Come here." Alondra walked over to me. I put my arms around her and pulled her close. "You know what is crazy?" I said gently. "You thinking you could be second to anyone." She melted in my arms, and together we collapsed onto the bed. Even before we received the first ratings, we were picked up for an indefinite run. The station moved us into an expensive, though impersonal, condo, and ads for our show began appearing on billboards, in magazines, and on the sides of buses. For a time, everything looked bright and shiny and normal, but I knew it wouldn't last. It didn't. Chapter 17. Call 1288, 12:22 a.m. Sandy's music. "Is that me? Am I on?" "Yes, caller, you're on the air." "Oh, God, I'm so nervous." "I didn't know I'd be this nervous." "What is your name, caller, and where are you from?" "My name is Sandy, and I'm from Amarillo." "All right, Sandy, where are you going to take us tonight?" "I've never told anyone this, because I thought people would think I was crazy. But listening to your other callers, well, I just have to tell someone." "That's what we're here for." "Oh, I'm so nervous. Am I really on the air?" "Just take a deep breath, Sandy, and tell us what happened." Okay. Well, this was when I was in high school. Some of us had gone to a party. Nothing wild, just kid stuff. But it had run pretty late. It must have been like 1, maybe 2 in the morning by the time we were driving home. Now, there were 4 of us in the car. Me and my boyfriend, Jake, my best friend, Tawny, and her boyfriend, Carson. The party was like in this weird part of town. None of us knew it very well, and on the way home, we got lost. And not just lost, it was weird. We ended up in this big area with all these industrial buildings. You know, like warehouses or something. And it was like we couldn't get out. Or like the complex went on forever. No matter how long we drove, or which corner we turned, we still found ourselves driving down these empty streets, past these big, empty buildings. They looked weird, scary. Not like any buildings I've seen before, and it started to creep us out pretty quickly. Jake and Carson tried to make jokes about it, but I could hear in their voices that they were scared. You know what I mean? What that sounds like, especially with boys that age? I do, Sandy. And then what happened? I think Tawny heard it first. Or maybe it was me? No, I think it was definitely Tawny, because I clearly remember her saying, "Sandy, do you hear that?" Those words, the way she said them, I remember it like it happened yesterday. What was it? Well, I couldn't tell at first. But when I listened real close, I heard it too. Sandy, what did you hear? Well, you know the music an ice cream truck plays? I don't mean the song, but the way that music sounds. I don't know what it's called, but you know what I'm talking about? Uh-huh. Well, it was like that, but sad. I don't think I've ever heard such sad music in all my life. It made me want to cry and scream at the same time. It made me want to run and never look back. And Tawny took it worse than me. She began to scream about how she wanted to get out of the car, how she had to get out of the car. But that was crazy. Where was she going to go? We were lost. We didn't even know where we were. So we just sat there silent and frightened, driving, with the music playing and Tawny screaming about wanting to get out of the car. I don't know how long this went on, but the sun was coming up when we finally found our way out and got home. When I climbed into bed, I heard that music again, just briefly for like 20 seconds. Like it was trying to reach me one last time, like it was trying to say goodnight. That's quite a story, Sandy. Wait, there's more. I'm coming up on a break, Sandy. You've got 30 seconds. Okay. I tried to find that part of town for years afterward. Those warehouses or whatever. I never could. It just wasn't there. Phantom Industrial Parks and the saddest music you've ever heard. This is Ghost Radio, live with you till 5. And if you want to join us, I'll give the numbers to call after this break. Chapter 18. The Prison of Conventions. I write these words in ink, in a composition book. No cross-outs, no backtracking. Just one big vomit of truth. But where do I start? I don't like talking about myself. I don't even like thinking about myself. But sometimes you need to dig around in the garden of your past, rummage through the weeds and grubs, searching for that main root. I guess the root of my life and all its problems sprouted when my father decided to marry my mother. He came from a family ruled by social convention and appearances. A family for whom it was less important what you did than how you did it. My father hated this attitude. And by marrying my mother, he made that crystal clear. He was ostracized by the family and erased from his father's will. To his family, my mother would never be anything more than a squaw, a nobody, a nothing. Marrying such a woman just wasn't done. They had someone else in mind. Her name was Marlene Koenig. She was everything they wanted. Cultured, bright, well turned out. She even had some vague connection to the British aristocracy. Dad's family loved that. She would make a proper wife. Miss Koenig was keen on the idea, too. Dad stood out among the parade of well-scrubbed suitors who frequented her parents' Fifth Avenue apartment. Those Bradleys and Carltons elicited little more from Miss Koenig than the occasional nice or sweet. Dad was something different, a scientist with a bohemian edge, and both of these characteristics filled Miss Koenig with a demure debutante's version of lust. Father seriously considered the match. Miss Koenig's knack for conversation would suit him well as he climbed academia's greasy pole. She also had the approval of the Spencer family of industrialists. He would need grants for his work. They could provide. Did he love her? Not really. But he was a scientist and thought when it came to marriage, pragmatism might be a more rational guide than emotions. So, as he left for a conference in Mexico, he believed he would return a week later and ask Miss Koenig to marry him. He did not return for 10 years. He was chairing a panel on string theory at the National Autonomous University, and my mother was in the audience. She'd gone there on a whim. It was raining. She missed her bus. You know the drill. Despite the fact that she was no specialist and, frankly, not even very interested in the subject, she torpedoed the panel of speakers with a series of incisive questions. By the end of the session, my father was both annoyed and intrigued. Who was this girl? Her simple common sense had shredded his presentation like one of the paper cutouts Mexicans make for the Day of the Dead. He caught up with her at the subway that evening and never left her sight again. Love at first sight, they say. Whatever. Miss Koenig married a banker and spent much of the next 20 years in and out of the Betty Ford Clinic. My parents smile whenever they see her name in the headlines. And so into this world of fairy tale love I came, like the eel in a koi pond. I wasn't what my parents expected or wanted. Almost from birth, I fought their attempts to mold me into the perfect, sunny expression of their love. I was queen of the temper tantrum, princess of no, and mistress of rage. My parents largely ignored my behavior. They turned inward, losing themselves in their idyllic romance. Their relationship actually was idyllic, powered by equal amounts of goodwill and affection. And passion, too, I guess. It's baffling, but I can attest to it. I was there for most of the soap opera. My father may have sent his inheritance straight to hell, but my mother also made sacrifices, dropping out of med school to follow her crazy Irishman. He, meanwhile, complaining that his colleagues were unimaginative and incompetent, resigned from his professorship in quantum physics at Harvard. The two of them lived on their modest teacher salaries in the Colonia Roma, a hip neighborhood in Mexico City, until my father finally decided to go back to the United States. He had some new ideas he wanted to bounce off his former colleagues, and more important, he needed financial backing, something that would be hard to find in Mexico for a problematic gringo who didn't know how to kiss university officials' asses and who virulently despised politicians and opportunists. My mother tried to convince him to stay. She loved her city. Life made more sense there than it ever would in an anonymous American suburb. But for once, my father wouldn't listen. He was convinced that it was time, not just for professional reasons, he explained, but also to deal with unfinished family business, and to express his opposition to U.S. interventionist policies in a way that really mattered. Vietnam. Out here, anyone can speak out against the war, and it makes no difference. But if I get a professorship in the States, I won't just be working. I'll be able to directly influence U.S. academics. My mother thought it was bullshit. Another of her husband's idealist fantasies. She'd learned to live with them, but they still drove her up the wall. Nonetheless, she gave in. Within months, we had packed a few belongings, sold everything else, and boarded a plane to Boston. What happened next is irrelevant. High school, college, boyfriends with acne, 10 million comics read beneath the covers, psychopathic snipers, political correctness, thermoses filled with gin, overweight couples holding hands, distant wars, unreliable condoms, ecstasy, the cure, discovery of a voracious sexual appetite that would lead to good times and more foul-ups, an arrest or two, Dostoevsky and Bukowski. My life moved beyond the mundane when I finally found a way to link my true interests with an academic and professional pretext that justified them. After years of denial, I accepted that my true passion was comic books, reading them, drawing them, writing them, and, why not, researching them. I realized they could be seen as a means of pop expression, as the sketchy realizations, with their low cost and unique accessibility, of people's aspirations, ideals, and fears. I spent my childhood obsessed with the comics that I was forbidden to read. Any book with more than 5 pictures was suspect, from the lowbrow adventures of Kaliman and Mickey Mouse to Tintin, Superman, Asterix, and Corto Maltese. It made no difference. Anything with thought bubbles was instantly condemned, even thrown out the window. "It's entertainment for imbeciles and illiterates," my father said. This forbidden aspect was part of their allure. I concentrated on studying and writing my thesis, While comics were often used for the most base and mercenary ends, as propaganda tools, vehicles for consumer and religious training, mechanisms for controlling the masses, and systems of sentimental education, I postulated that they could also be used to break the information monopoly of mass media consortiums, the ideological oppression of the state, and the mental laziness of those incapable of opening a book. It's not that I thought humanity would free itself from its chains by reading the funny pages, but I fervently believed that they had something valid to say, even if it was in the most basic sense. The first time I read something about Marx, Freud, or Ho Chi Minh, it was in a comic by the Mexican cartoonist Ruiz. He may not have spurred me on to communism, but his work opened my mind to a different avenue of learning. Okay, I'll admit my theory was nothing out of this world. Similar stuff had been said by dozens of others. Many simply wanted to justify their juvenile passions. I wanted to take it further. So I started digging through art history, and without having to look too hard, I rediscovered the Mexican muralists, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, and the artist José Guadalupe Posada. Adding a dash of the ancient pre-Columbian pictographic tradition, I had a set of visual criteria that offered an interesting portrait of Mexican culture. Armed with these concepts, I returned to Mexico and contacted several groups that made underground comics and zines. I spent months researching and documenting their work. By the time I had enough for a decent thesis, I was already collaborating on a strip for the magazine Gallito Comics. I had also moved in with Alberto Mejia, an artist who dreamed of becoming a famous painter but drew comics and political cartoons for a newspaper for a living. Alberto and I didn't last much longer than the time it took us to illustrate a few pages. That's when I met Joaquin. I didn't go to Mexico looking for romance, but I didn't foresee meeting Joaquin. The day I met him began so strangely. I woke that morning with an odd vision. A series of letters arranged in a very specific way filled my mind. I wrote them down on a sheet of paper in the form of a cross. One letter per line, E, N, I, and then all in one line, T, N, U, J, A, and once again, B, N. I stared at them. They had no meaning that I could determine, no relation to anything I could think of, yet they seemed important. Very important. I tried to work on one of my comics, but the letters obsessed me. Every few minutes my eyes would return to the pad. It was as if these letters in this pattern possessed an almost religious significance, an undeniable, transcendent power. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. The letters appeared to be completely random. They didn't form words. They didn't even suggest sounds. They were just letters. And the pattern didn't seem to have any obvious significance, but I knew it meant something. I felt this was the most important thing I'd ever seen in my life. I would kill for these letters. I would build temples to these letters. If these letters could talk, I would do anything they said. It was bizarre. I had never been excitable or fanatical. My love of comics was deep and powerful, but it didn't even touch this. This was huge. I took a shower hoping the feeling would wash away, but as the water pounded against my skin, all I could think about were those letters. They had a hold on me. I wanted to jump out of the shower, run back to my desk, grab that pad, and cradle it in my arms like a baby. But I fought the urge, turned up the hot water. Maybe I could steam these crazy urges from my soul. Slowly, as the vapor filled my nostrils, the urge dissipated. By the afternoon, I returned to work on my comic, and by evening, guests started arriving for a party Alberto had arranged. The letters were all but forgotten. Chapter 19. Finding Alondra. Finding Alondra completely changed my life. I met her at a party thrown by some acquaintances who created underground comics. I was sleep-deprived and unenthusiastic at the thought of going out. Every time I went to one of these things, I'd ask myself the same question. Why bother? Usually I returned home bearing the same answer. Next time, don't bother. Friends I hadn't seen in months would greet me from the bottom of bottles and roach ends of joints. I'd see desirable women on the arms of total jerks, stave off hunger by eating potato chips and drinking liquor so noxious I could feel my liver corroding before it even reached my stomach. On this particular occasion, I found a chair in a corner of the kitchen next to an artist who wrote and drew a comic about a zombie superhero. I pretended to be interested. Zombo is like a classic superhero with foibles, anxieties, and problems. You know, the whole Stan Lee thing, he told me. What are his superpowers, I asked. Well, he's immortal because he's already dead. He lives in a grave and only comes out at night. He defends democracy and protects his girl. Why would a zombie care about democracy? Because he's a modern vigilante. Oh, of course, I said, suppressing a laugh. A woman, dressed head to toe in black, with full lips painted the same color, approached. So, what's Zombo up to these days? She asked with a smile. She had a subtle accent I couldn't place. Defending the world from injustice. And protecting democracy from its enemies? She added, giving me what seemed like a conspiratorial look. Have you met Joaquin? He's a disc jockey. A disc jockey? She asked, considering me coolly. I let the question go unanswered. I didn't want to talk about my job. I knew a disc jockey once. Killed himself by jumping in front of a train, Alondra said. I didn't know what to make of this comment. Hostility? Ridicule? I wasn't sure. Unable to think of a rejoinder, I asked her name. Alondra, she said. It sounded like a challenge. Are you also an expert on zombies? I asked, hoping to sound witty. I'm an expert on a lot of things, but zombies aren't a favorite. Zombo's creator grasped Alondra's sarcasm and his face fell. I seized the moment. Frankly, my main problem with Zombo is that he has a really stupid name, I ventured. He stared at me in confusion. He was obviously trying to hold in the anger that would make him look like what he was, a ridiculous, easily offended cartoonist. He decided to laugh instead. It's meant to be stupid, he said limply. His name's the least of his worries. Believe me, I've read most of his adventures, Alondra said, moving closer to me. Well, it's a work in progress. Progressively decomposing. But for a zombie, that might be a good thing. Crestfallen, the artist got up and limped away. I already liked everything about Alondra. Her face, the black dress she wore trimmed with antique lace, her hair, her hands, the accent that seemed ripped from the soundtrack of an old Superman cartoon. So what do you do? I asked. Guess, she said, a hint of playfulness dancing in her eyes. Well, you dress like you're in a goth band, which means you're not. Good. Too sarcastic for an actress. Much too sarcastic. Too independent to have come here on someone's arm. Yes, my arms are free. And since this is a party for underground comics people, you must be one of them. Nice deduction, Sherlock. I gave her a courtly bow. The guest list kind of tipped my hand. I nodded. What might you have guessed without that? Serial killer? I blurted out. She laughed and some of her armor slipped away. The conversation shifted, becoming easier, looser. We talked about comic books and hip-hop, politics and food, websites and the crime rate in Mexico City. She told me a little about the trajectory that had carried her to the federal district. You hungry? She wanted to know. Hardly at all, no. I ruined my appetite with a rancid bag of something I found lying around here, I answered. Let's go eat something more substantial. Without another word, she headed for the apartment door. I followed. Just as we were crossing the threshold, Alberto came up to us. Where are you going? He asked Alondra. I'm having dinner with my friend Joaquin here. I'd known Alberto for some time. In fact, I'd invited him onto my program back when it followed the conventional cultural broadcasting model. He was upset, but keeping his cool. Barely. At the time, Alondra's bluntness, while refreshing, seemed a little cruel to me. I couldn't help identifying with poor Alberto. I'd been that guy more than once. Hell, we all have. "You want me to come along?" he asked feebly. "You should stay with your guests," Alondra said, but in a tone that made it sound more like, "Fuck off." "When will you be back?" "Not sure. I'll have to come back eventually. My stuff is here. Don't wait up." I said goodbye, but Alberto didn't answer. We left silently, not speaking until we climbed into my car. "What was that? It seemed like you were a little mean." "I behaved impeccably," Alondra responded. "Where are we going?" I took her to Charco de las Ranas for tacos. It wasn't easy for us to pick up the conversation again, which was mostly my fault. I kept expecting an explanation. For a while I feigned interest, but I couldn't focus on what Alondra was telling me about popular myths and traditions in Papua, and eventually I interrupted. "It seemed like something serious happened with Alberto back there. Do you have any idea what it might have been?" He acted jealous. "Yeah, I suppose so." "Does he have any reason to be?" "People have reasons for a lot of stupid shit," she answered. "I guess it might be because you've been with him in his group for a while. He must feel a certain attachment or affection for you." "Maybe he was disappointed that you left in the middle of his party," I said, choosing my words carefully so they wouldn't sound like an accusation. "Maybe." "But you don't think so?" She shook her head. "What do you think it is?" "I fucked him a few times," she said, biting into her beefsteak taco. I nearly choked on my glass of horchata. "Pardon? I thought you knew." "But don't worry, it's meaningless." "Where I come from, doing something like that to another man can end up costing you your life," I said, although inwardly I doubted that this would be the case with Alberto and me. "Don't be dramatic. That's the way it goes. I'm crashing at his place. I got bored. It happens. But still, I'm not cheating on anyone, Joaquin. Eat your tacos." I didn't have an answer for this woman who seemed more attractive, fascinating, and dangerous with each passing moment. At this point, Alondra changed the subject. Clearly, she wasn't interested in talking about Alberto anymore, and I have to admit I was grateful. We finished eating, and on the way to the car, she asked me where I wanted to go. I suggested a bar, and she agreed, so I decided to take her to a hole-in-the-wall over on Medellin Avenue, a ruined garage where musicians, artists, gang members, politicians, and other bums came to drink and dance until dawn. The noise was overwhelming, but the ambiance was worth it. Alondra seemed to enjoy herself. It was hot in the club, so I took off the jacket I'd been wearing all night. Alondra noticed my forearm. I have an odd tattoo that often raises an eyebrow or two, but nothing prepared me for Alondra's reaction. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into a corner of the club, where the lighting was better. She studied the tattoo. A look of concern, even fear, marked her face. "You don't like it?" I asked feebly. "What does it mean?" she said, her eyes wide and her lips trembling. "Would you believe me if I told you I don't know?" "How can that be?" "I used to raise quite a bit of hell. After one of those hell-raising nights, I woke up with this on my arm." Alondra looked deep in my eyes, and after what seemed like an eternity, she said, "Do you believe in premonitions?" "I don't know, maybe." "Well, I didn't. But I do now," she said, and kissed me on the cheek. All this because of my crazy tattoo? I looked down at it, wondering what it could possibly mean to this girl. It meant nothing to me. Just an odd collection of letters in the shape of a cross. E-N-I-T-N-U-J-A-A-B-N. Around 4 a.m, we left. I didn't have to say a word. We climbed into the car and drove toward the National University campus sculpture garden, where we waited for the sunrise, telling each other our dreams and nightmares. At 8 a.m, I took her back, having done nothing more than talk to her. Well, I did get that one kiss on the cheek. I doubt Alberto slept that night. In the following days, I saw Alondra several more times. We visited all the little-known spots in the city that interested her, temples and ruins, old cantinas and dilapidated stores. We spent our second afternoon together in my bed, and after that we found several cheap hotels and motels in different parts of the city. We could have gone to my apartment, but the hotels fit well on the list of urban attractions Alondra wanted to explore. Every day I tried to convince her to come live with me, to leave Alberto's house once and for all. It wasn't long before it felt like Alberto and I traded places. Now that she was with me, I was the one suffering anguish and nightmares about the two of them together. Alondra was still sleeping under his roof, and although I believed there was nothing between them, there was always a nagging uncertainty. Alondra told me living with him was convenient because they were collaborating on a comic book, but eventually she finally had enough of Alberto's tearful pleading. One morning after we returned from a trip, she showed up at my apartment with her 2 suitcases. We took a quick shower together. I couldn't believe my luck, but a voice inside my head kept saying, "Be careful." Alondra didn't make any promises, but she delivered no warnings either. Our relationship was non-judgmental, but also non-committal. I told myself I was content, but really I wanted more. My night shift was wonderfully convenient for both of us, and she continued to be active in the underground comic scene, where she created, edited, and published various books. I told Alondra about my job in general terms, about my program and the unexpected turn it had taken. I explained how my vocation as a professional broadcaster was thanks, in large part, to my nighttime callers, who contributed the material we discussed every evening. By then I trusted Alondra enough to start telling her how, sometimes, the stories I heard on the show resonated strangely with my personal life. How, in a way, I didn't believe it was sheer coincidence the program had taken this course. I know that, in the beginning, Alondra thought I had a screw loose, or, more likely, was inventing macabre stories in hopes of appealing to that little necrophile all goth women carry within them. However, her aesthetic tastes didn't translate into an interest in ghost stories or supernatural phenomena. As for myself, convincing anyone of the importance or veracity of the stories I heard each day was not a priority. In the beginning, it didn't seem relevant to me whether what callers said was true or not. Finding rational explanations or dissecting their errors of perception and judgment was beside the point. The interesting thing was unraveling the worries, fears, and ambitions these tales embodied. Sometimes the stories were of a purely social or economic nature. Others were flagrantly edible. Of course, I had learned to weed out the pranksters, and each night there were a few disturbed individuals who injected their own insanity into the show, something that could be both entertaining and exasperating. The real problems I ran up against, though, were my own. I had trouble identifying them largely because I didn't understand them well enough to articulate what they were. It may sound pretentious, but I've always been courted by death. Chapter 20. Tattooed. One might think the coincidence of the tattoo would have scared me. I've never been a fan of fate, and this felt like fate. No, it was more like destiny, but for some reason I wasn't afraid. Joaquin seemed intelligent, laid back, and unconventional, a combination I've always found attractive. And there was the destiny angle, which made him seem dangerous. No woman, whatever crap they tell you, can resist that. But despite all of this, I wasn't anticipating a long relationship. I planned to continue traveling across Mexico, and I wanted to do it alone. I had no intention of bringing anyone with me, and I wasn't going to modify my itinerary. I certainly didn't want commitment or anything else to distract me from my goals. So when I told him I was going to Oaxaca to see Monte Alban, Mitla, and Zachila, to interview artist Francisco Toledo and maybe work in his studio, I was caustic, almost abusive. Joaquin seemed to get it at first, but his silence didn't last long. Even now I'm not sure how he did it, but he convinced me that we could travel together without getting in each other's way, with the understanding that I could split from him at any time without explanation or drama. Ultimately, our journey extended far beyond Oaxaca. We continued traveling cross-country and went to Chiapas, across the border into Guatemala and Belize, and back to Mexico through Quintana Roo. After a few days in Mérida, we went into Campeche and, finally, Veracruz. Joaquin was taking time off from his radio show, which had just won some prize and was unexpectedly developing a following, both on the web and the conventional airwaves. I made no secret of the fact that the premise seemed absurdly old-fashioned to me. Was there still an audience out there interested in listening to ghost stories? Especially in an era so predisposed toward the visual, the spectacle, special effects, It seemed bizarre that anyone would have the patience and, the naivete to respond to them. Of course, who was I to talk? Comics were also hopelessly retrograde. But comics possessed a charm, while radio just seemed tawdry. Or so I thought. I was wrong, both about Joaquin and about his program. I enjoyed his company during the trip. I fulfilled all my research goals while discovering many aspects of Mexico I'd never known. Meanwhile, I found myself becoming fond of even Joaquin's weirdest habits. The odd way he coughed when nervous, the adamant way he argued when drunk. I even succumbed to the gooey-eyed way he looked at me. I missed him when he wasn't around. Yep, I was in love. Wholly and completely, though I hated myself a little for it. When we got back, I didn't pause for even a moment to consider whether it was time to move in or not. I leaped in head first. Going back to his apartment to stay seemed like the most natural thing in the world. During the trip, we talked a lot about the show. He told me how it had evolved and transformed. But why would people listen to ghost stories over and over again? I asked him. You have great eyes, he replied. Frankly, I don't get it. They're all the same. Like a tiger's. You'd think they'd get bored, shining in the jungle. I'm trying to talk about your show. My subject is more interesting, he said, raising his eyebrows flirtatiously. An hour later, our clothes strewn across the floor, I got him to talk about the show. Our interests are similar. What you're looking for in comic books isn't so different from what I'm trying to do with radio. They're both examples of low-tech that's seductive. And speaking of seduction, I think, come on, I really want to hear your take. Okay. I think of what I'm doing as a sort of confessional. Or if you prefer a less religious metaphor, a psychoanalyst's couch. People call in to talk about their fears and phobias, things they've imagined or that have really happened to them, things they wish had happened. If the story's good, we all enjoy it. If not, at least the caller is getting it off his chest. And our listeners are looking for that element of surprise, the power of spontaneity, the unexpected, the limitless possibilities offered by other people's secrets. I don't want to disappoint you, but that sounds like the same logic that Dr. Phil uses to justify his brainless talk show. Is that what you're after? Part of me was just trying to provoke him, but I was also authentically curious. Oh, you want to argue? I say we settle it with a wrestling match. Joaquin, best 2 out of 3 falls wins. Answer my question. Of course the loser wins, too, he said, his eyes doing that gooey thing. How about some verbal wrestling? Mine sounds better. I got up off the floor and slipped back into my clothes. Now she's getting dressed. Might be talked out of them. Joaquin smiled. Okay, I'll answer your question, he said, then laughing. What was it again? Some days and orgasms later, I finally got an answer. Generally, I'm just letting people talk. It's great if it helps people resolve their issues. But I think I'm a lot like the audience. I like to listen to them. But you told me that sometimes the callers make a sport of tearing everything apart, mistrusting, mocking, even outright insulting those who share their deepest intimacies and fears. How do you expect to resolve a conflict in the midst of so much animosity? I don't. That's up to the callers themselves. Most of the listeners know what they're getting into. I can't do anything other than ask for a certain level of respect and do my best to filter the nastier calls. In the end, if confrontations arise, that's part of the package. I doubt anyone is so naive that they would tell their story on air and not expect some criticism. I questioned Joaquin aggressively for several days, between bouts of equally aggressive sex. I wasn't trying to convince him that the show was immoral, exploitive, or inconsequential, nor did I really question his convictions. Curiosity drove me, and he disarmed me through simple logic and an implacable sincerity. And that damn gooey-eyed look. He had it all clear in his head, and his own brushes with death had bolstered his determination. Even if he was often skeptical about the stories he heard, he obviously felt a kind of respect for those who called in. Whether I believe them or not is what matters, he'd always say. In our talks, Joaquin never missed a chance to point out the parallels between his work and the underground comics that obsessed me. Both forms of media were opening up new channels of expression, and each spoke its own language, an argot that was at once popular, spontaneous, vibrant, and raw. Each was an irreverent take on an old genre. Each could be provocative, and both used shock as a means of communication. Little by little, almost without realizing it, I settled in Mexico permanently. I'd traveled a lot, but this was the first time I'd chosen a home of my own volition, not because it was imposed on me or for practical reasons. After a few interviews, I was hired by the political science department of a private university. It wasn't a spectacular position, and it didn't pay much, but I didn't care. I still worked with several comic book artists, including Alberto. Because he had been my lover, he thought he deserved certain privileges which annoyed me and drove Joaquin crazy. I hate jealousy. Never understood it. But Joaquin even made that charming. His eyes found a new shade of gooey. Love and her odd magic. Yes, we were in love. But how do you talk about it? All those terrible cliches. There's something indecent about talking or writing about love. It cheapens the feeling, and it's an emotion that none of us understand even when we think we do. If, in a moment of intimacy, someone asks if I love him, I find myself overwhelmed. I feel as embarrassed as I would publicly debating my innermost feelings in an auditorium full of strangers. But I promised myself I'd try. Here, in this composition book. But I still can't. So I'll return to the facts. But wait, I think there may be one word that describes my feelings for Joaquin. Tattooed. I'd been drawn in by a tattoo, then tattooed by love. Okay, that's enough. If I write any more about it, this will take a hard turn toward cliché land. Back to the facts. I'm always better with facts. Our daily life was unorthodox. Joaquin would return from the radio program at dawn. He almost always woke me up, and we would be together. Together in every sense of the word. And after an hour or more of that, we'd have breakfast and sleep until noon. Then I'd head for the university, and when I got back, we'd be together until he went to the radio station around 10 p.m. Then I'd work on my projects, see my friends, and do the other things my life demanded. We were perfectly synchronized, but one day Joaquin proposed that we make a change. He wanted me to start working with him on the show. I thought it was a rotten idea. We had something good. Why spoil it? I need you here, he told me. You could make a huge contribution to the show. It's got nothing to do with spending time together. Your knowledge and skepticism, your perspective and humor, they would really enrich the program. Right now, incredible things are happening. There's more and more interest, more sponsors, more money. Let's not ruin what we have. I was sure he'd never convince me, and I pumped up the volume of Dead Ship, Dark Ship by Sorry About Dresden. My eyes are threatening to open wide tonight for the first time. I try to cover them up with a pillow's side. Twilight, made up and hated, so bright-like, shards of blood and rust and light. We went back and forth, back and forth. The more he asked, the more I fought it, and one night he became adamant and I became cruel. You're just jealous of me having any life that excludes you. And with that I stormed out of the apartment. But it was all an act. Earlier that day I had decided to say yes. I just wanted to make him suffer a little bit. At first I thought ghost radio would be an interesting experience, a diversion from my work on comic books. I didn't realize then what had happened to Joaquin, what was still happening to him. To me, the program was just a job. It wasn't long before I discovered that for him it was more. Much more. Chapter 21. Call 2305. Friday, 1:35 a.m. The Soldier. The woman's voice was delicate and soft, but I liked it. I didn't want to ask her to speak up, so I had Watt boost the gain, hoping the lace-like tone of her vowels would be preserved.
My Ramon didn't want to go to Iraq. He said so all the time. Those people haven't done anything to me, or my family, or anyone I know. I don't want to kill them. Well, they sent him anyway, and he couldn't do anything about it. On the night of April 17th, I woke up screaming. My husband was asleep, and he just mumbled, "It's all right, go back to sleep." But I was too upset. I walked into Ramon's room, and he was standing there, as if he was waiting for something. "Son, what are you doing here?" I asked him. I imagined the worst. "I just came by to say hi because I missed you a lot, Ma." His voice was calm. I could sense that he didn't want to scare me. "Don't give me that. Tell me the truth. Why are you here?" "Oh, Ma, aren't you glad to see me?" "Don't play games with me," I told him. "You've brought me bad news. People don't just appear out of nowhere." "If you keep it up, I'm leaving, Ma." "Don't leave. Just tell me the truth." "No, Ma. You're way too suspicious. I better go back." Then I heard a really loud noise coming from the kitchen. I turned to see what it was, and when I turned back, my son wasn't there anymore. He'd gone away. I threw myself on his bed and cried for the rest of the night. The next morning, my husband asked what was wrong with me. He could see that I'd stayed in Ramon's room all night, and my eyes were swollen from crying so much. I started to tell him what I'd seen, but I hadn't said more than 10 words when they knocked on the door. They were 2 military officers dressed up real formal-like, looking serious.